They called Gideon Hale a fool. They said his wife was worse, a woman who'd talked a sensible man into throwing their last dollar at 41 scrawny, flea-bitten goats that not a single rancher in Clearwater County would touch. The whole valley laughed. But that August, when the sky turned orange and the fire came screaming down from the western hills faster than any horse could run, nobody was laughing anymore. If you've ever been told your idea was worthless, if you've ever been the last one standing when everyone else said you couldn't, this story is for you. Watch it until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The goats arrived on a Tuesday, which Mara would later say was fitting, because nothing good ever seemed to happen on a Tuesday. She was standing on the porch of their cabin when she heard the wagon coming up the Dry Creek Road. Heard it before she saw it, the wood groaning and the wheels grinding over ruts baked hard as iron. Gideon was driving, sitting up on the bench with his hat pulled low against the afternoon glare, and even from 50 yards away, Mara could see the set of his jaw. That particular jaw set meant he'd done something he wasn't entirely sure she'd forgive him for. She looked past him at the wagon bed. There were goats in it, a dozen at least, packed in tight, their long flat faces pressed against the side slats. And behind the wagon, tied on ropes in a line that stretched back down the road like some kind of sorry parade, were more goats. Skinny ones, patchy ones, a few with ribs showing through their coats like old barrel staves. One had a crooked horn that curled back toward its own ear. Another appeared to be missing most of its tail. Mara stood very still on the porch. She did not say anything until Gideon pulled the team to a stop and climbed down, brushing road dust off his shirt with both hands. 41, he said, before she could open her mouth. 41, she repeated. I know how it looks. Do you? Mara? Gideon. She said his name quietly, which was worse than if she'd shouted it. That was our seed money. That was everything we had left after the well repair and the... I know what it was. Then explain to me, she said, stepping down off the porch, what on God's green earth I'm looking at. He took his hat off and turned it in his hands. Behind him, one of the goats let out a sound that could only be described as an argument with itself. Another one had started chewing on the rope tying it to the wagon. Old Hennessy was selling out, Gideon said. Pulled up stakes, moving his family to Colorado. He had cattle, horses, pigs, all of it went at auction, gone in 2 hours. But nobody wanted the goats, not one bid. He was going to just turn them loose on the range. And you thought, I'll take them. I thought, they're cheap. How cheap? He told her the figure. It was so low she almost laughed, which she didn't because laughing would have been the wrong kind of laughing. 41 goats, she said again. She walked along the line of them, looking each one over with the flat expression of a woman reviewing a long series of disappointing decisions. Gideon, these animals look like they lost a war. They're thin. They'll put on weight. This one has a horn growing into its own head. I noticed that. What are we supposed to do with 41 goats on a cattle ranch? He didn't answer right away. He put his hat back on and looked out at the pasture, at the yellow-brown grass that hadn't seen decent rain since April. The sky above the western ridge was white with heat. Everything was dry. The creek at the bottom of their land had been down to a trickle since June, and what water there was had a greenish color that Mara didn't trust and the cattle refused to drink. I don't know yet, he said, but I had a feeling about them. She looked at him. A feeling, she said. Yes. Mara Hale. She'd been Mara Whitlock when she'd come west from Ohio 6 years ago, 23 years old and full of a confidence that the Wyoming territory had spent considerable effort wearing down, was not a woman who put a lot of stock in feelings. She believed in work. She believed in water rights and soil quality and the tensile strength of fence wire. She believed that the frontier punished sentiment and rewarded preparation. But she also knew her husband. She knew that Gideon Hale's feelings were not the dreamy, impractical kind. They were the kind that came from somewhere quiet and observant in him, from the part of his brain that noticed things other people walked past. He'd had a feeling about buying their land when everyone said the parcel was too rocky. He'd had a feeling about drilling the second well when their first one ran low. Both times he'd been right. Both times, she'd been the one standing on a porch watching him do something that looked a lot like stupidity until it didn't. She looked at the goats again. Then she looked at the land. Then she breathed out slowly through her nose. "Put them in the south pasture," she said, "away from the cattle." "Yes. And don't tell me how much the feed's going to cost." "I wasn't planning to." She went back inside. So, by the end of the week, the whole county knew about the goats. In a place like Clearwater County, news traveled the way fire did on a dry day, fast, and in all directions at once. There were maybe 400 families spread across the valley and the surrounding range, connected by 2 general stores, 1 telegraph office, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse 3 days a week, and a network of gossip so efficient it would have impressed a telegraph operator. The story, as it circulated, went something like this. Gideon Hale, who already had enough problems, 2 years of bad crops, a sick cattle herd that had dropped from 60 head to 38, a homestead claim that more than one man in the county had suggested might not survive another dry season, had taken what little money he and his wife had left and spent it on 41 of the sorriest-looking goats anyone had ever seen. Goats that Hennessy, who was himself not known for high standards, hadn't been able to give away. The version that got repeated most often added, with considerable pleasure, that the goats had already eaten through part of Gideon's hay stockpile and knocked over 2 fence sections, and that one of them had apparently gotten into the vegetable garden and eaten everything down to the soil. That last part was true. Mara had walked out one morning to find a medium-sized brown goat standing in the middle of what had been her kitchen garden, looking profoundly untroubled, surrounded by the remnants of her tomato plants and her last 3 cabbages. She'd stood there for a long moment. Then she'd gone and gotten Gideon. He'd stood there for a long moment too. The goat looked at both of them and made a sound that communicated no remorse whatsoever. "The fence needs to be higher," Gideon said. "Yes," said Mara. "It does." Brock Mercer came by on a Friday afternoon, riding a horse that cost more than most men in the county made in a year. He had 2 of his ranch hands with him, which was the way Brock usually traveled, with witnesses, so that whatever he said got remembered correctly, or at least got remembered the way he wanted it to. Brock Mercer was 44 years old and owned the largest cattle operation in the valley. He had 3,000 acres of deeded land, 200 head of breeding stock, a house with glass windows and a wooden floor throughout, and the kind of confidence that came from having been right, or at least from having been powerful enough that being wrong didn't cost him much. He was not an unintelligent man. He was, in Mara's assessment, the specific kind of intelligent that made a person dangerous, smart enough to see what he wanted, and smooth enough to make taking it look like a favor. He'd been after their land for 2 years. Not pushing, exactly. Not threatening, just circling. Showing up every few months with an offer that was always slightly higher than the last one, delivered in a tone that suggested he was doing them a kindness, rescuing them from a situation that any sensible person could see was going to end badly. Gideon had turned him down each time, politely but firmly. Brock had always ridden away looking more amused than disappointed, which was somehow more insulting than if he'd been angry. He rode up to the front of the cabin now and sat his horse with the easy posture of a man who never had to hurry. His ranch hands stayed back a little, the way they always did. "Gideon," he said, tipping his hat. "Mara." She'd come out to stand beside her husband. She didn't say anything. "Heard about your new livestock," Brock said. There was a smile in his voice that hadn't quite reached his face. "Had to come see for myself." "They're in the south pasture," Gideon said. "You're welcome to look at them." "Don't need to look, I believe it." Brock shifted in his saddle. 41 goats, Gideon. That's what you spent Hennessy's money on." "My money," Gideon said. "I bought them with my money." "Of course you did." Brock looked out at the range, at the burned-looking grass, at the dry creek bed visible from where they stood. "Hard summer. Hard couple of summers, if we're honest." "We're surviving." "Sure you are." He pulled a folded paper from inside his vest and held it out. "I've revised my offer. Figured, given everything, it might be a good time to revisit the conversation." Gideon didn't take the paper. "I'm not interested, Brock." "Don't need to decide today. Take a few days. Talk to your wife." A pause. "Might be wise to think it through before you put more of your savings into animals that are going to eat you out of house and home." "The offer's not changing anything for us," Mara said. Her voice was level. She'd had 2 years of practice keeping it level around Brock Mercer. "We appreciate you riding out." He looked at her for a moment, His smile was patient and slightly pitying, the smile of a man who believed that other people's stubbornness was ultimately his advantage. "Offer stands as long as I'm feeling generous," he said, "which, knowing myself, probably won't be forever." He folded the paper and put it back in his vest. "You take care now, both of you." He touched the brim of his hat. "And good luck with your goats." He rode away. His ranch hands followed. Gideon stood watching the road for a while after they'd gone. "He's going to keep coming," Mara said. "I know it. As long as we're struggling, he's going to keep coming." "I know that too." He looked down at the folded paper she hadn't noticed him take from the railing, where Brock had left it when she wasn't watching. He looked at the number written on it. Then he folded it up and put it in his pocket. "We're not selling." "I didn't ask." "I know you didn't. I'm telling you anyway." She looked at him. There was something tired in his face, and something else underneath the tiredness that she recognized. The same stubbornness she'd seen in him when he'd drilled the second well, when he'd stayed out in the cold for 3 days nursing a sick calf back to health, when he'd come home with 41 goats on a Tuesday afternoon and a jaw set like a man who'd done something he couldn't entirely defend but wasn't going to apologize for. She went inside to start supper. The mockery settled in like a second summer, steady, hot, and inescapable. It wasn't cruel, exactly. Most of the people in the valley weren't mean-spirited. They were just the particular kind of amused that comes from watching a neighbor do something baffling in circumstances that were already difficult. There was a comfort in it, she supposed. When your own situation was hard, it helped to have someone else's situation be harder and also funnier. At the general store in Hadley, the nearest town, Mara heard it. She'd gone in on a Thursday for flour and lamp oil, and the 2 women ahead of her at the counter, wives of cattle ranchers whose spreads were both larger than hers, were talking in the way people talk when they're not quite bothering to be quiet about it. 41 goats, one of them said. "I still can't get over it." From Hennessy, no less. Couldn't pay someone to take them. "I heard one of them ate her whole garden." "Most of her hay, too, the way I heard it." Doesn't that make you wonder sometimes what a person's thinking? Mara put her money on the counter and picked up her flour and her lamp oil. She nodded politely to both women on her way out, as she did every week, as she would do next week, and the week after that. There was no point in anything else. Outside, she loaded her supplies into the wagon and sat for a moment with the reins in her hands. The street was dry and dusty. The hardware store across the way had a line of men sitting on its porch in the afternoon shade, the way men did in summer when there wasn't enough work and too much heat. A few of them glanced over at her. One of them said something to another, and there was a low laugh that carried across the street without words. She drove home. What nobody in Clearwater County understood, what Gideon himself was only beginning to understand, was that the goats were teaching him something. It started as pure observation. He'd put them in the south pasture because it was the scroobiest part of their land, full of thorn brush and dried-out weeds and a particular kind of spiky grass that the cattle wouldn't touch. He'd figured they'd manage okay there. He hadn't expected much more. But he'd noticed, walking the fence line at dusk one evening in late June, that the south pasture looked different. It was cleaner. Not completely, the goats hadn't eaten everything, but the thorn brush was noticeably lower, chewed down to stubble in places where it had been knee-high a few weeks before. The dead grass, the dry weeds, the brittle scrub that accumulated in the low spots where nothing useful ever grew, it was gone. In its place was bare soil, and in a few spots, in the corners where the goats had apparently spent the most time, the ground had been cleared all the way down to dirt. He stood at the fence for a long time, looking at it. Then he moved them to the west pasture, which had even more brush. The goats went without complaint. Within 2 weeks, they'd cleared it down to ankle height. He didn't say anything to Mara about what he was thinking yet. He wasn't sure yet. The idea was still shapeless, more a direction than a plan, the kind of thought that needed room to become something before you put words to it. But he started watching the goats differently, started noticing what they chose to eat and what they left, how they moved through a piece of land, what they did with the tricky growth that cattle and horses turned their noses up at. There was something systematic about it, almost intentional looking, though he knew that was just the way observant people saw things. They found patterns whether there were patterns or not. It was in early July that he ran into Eli Dawson on the road to Hadley. Eli was 70-something and had lived in the valley longer than anyone, came out here before there was a proper road, before there was a town. He'd run cattle for years, then sheep for a while, then goats for a season when he was younger, for reasons he'd apparently never fully explained to anyone's satisfaction. He was regarded as something between a fixture and an eccentric, the kind of old man whose opinions people listen to with the particular patience you extend to someone who might actually know something useful if you can get past the way he tells it. They stopped their wagons on the road and passed a few minutes in the way of men who aren't in a hurry but both have somewhere to be. "Heard about your goats," Eli said, which Gideon had been expecting. "Everybody has," Gideon said. The old man looked out at the range. The hills to the west were brown and gray, the grass burned back to nothing by the summer heat. Up on the higher ridges, the thorn brush grew in dark tangles that hadn't seen fire or rain in months. "My second year out here," Eli said, "I watched a fire come down from the Broken Horn Ridge and take 3 ranches in one afternoon." He said it conversationally, the way a man mentions weather. "Biggest thing I ever saw. Wall of flame 6, 8 feet high, moving faster than you'd believe." "I've heard the stories." "Have you?" Eli looked at him sidelong. People always think they know about fire until they see one. Then they realize they didn't know anything. He was quiet for a moment. "You know what stopped it that year?" Gideon waited. "Old Prescott's place. Had a band of land around his buildings, 50, 60 feet wide, where he'd run goats all spring, nothing left to burn. Fire hit that strip and just..." He made a gesture with one hand, like a wave breaking on sand. "Died." Gideon didn't say anything. "Prescott was the only one in the valley that year who didn't lose a single building," Eli said. "Everybody thought he was lucky." A dry pause. "He wasn't lucky." They sat with that for a moment. "I should be moving," Eli said, picking up his reins. "Yeah," Gideon said. "Me too." He drove the rest of the way home in a silence that wasn't empty. That night, after supper, he spread a hand-drawn map of their property on the kitchen table. It was a map he'd made himself, rough but reasonably accurate, showing the cabin and the barn and the wells and the outbuildings and the pasture divisions. He put a lamp on it and looked at it for a long time. Mara came and looked over his shoulder. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Thinking." She sat down across from him. She'd learned over the years that when Gideon got quiet like this, the right thing was to wait rather than press. He'd come out with it eventually. He put his finger on the map. "If a fire came down from the western ridge," he said, "what's the first thing it would hit?" She looked at the map. "The north pasture, the hay barn." "Right." He traced a line. "Then the main barn. If the wind was out of the west, then the cabin." "That's always been the worry. What if we cleared a ring around the buildings, a proper ring, wide enough that a fire couldn't jump it?" He sat back. "I mean cleared, not just grazed, down to bare soil in places, or close enough." She looked at him. Then she looked at the map. Then she looked at the dark window that faced west, toward the hills. "The goats," she said. "They've cleared 2 pastures in less than a month. Real thick brush. They went through it like it wasn't there. That's different from a managed perimeter, Gideon. That's just pasture grazing." "Is it?" He pulled the map closer. "Eli Dawson told me something today." He repeated what the old man had said. Not word for word, but close enough. He watched her face while he did. She was quiet for a moment when he finished. "You want to use the goats to create a fire break," she said. "I want to try. That's going to take all summer. Probably. The county's already laughing at us. They'll laugh louder." She looked at the map. She was quiet for a longer time now, the kind of quiet that meant she was running through it. The logistics, the practicalities, the cost in time and materials and effort against the likelihood of return. That was the way her mind worked. She didn't trust gut feelings on their own. She needed to see the math of a thing, needed to turn it over and look at all its edges. "We'd have to move them systematically," she said finally. "Section by section. You can't just let them roam. They'll clear the wrong things, go where the good grass is instead of the brush." "I know. Ropes and temporary barriers. Move them every few days. It'll be hot work." "It'll be hot work." He looked at her. "What do you think?" She drummed her fingers once on the table, a habit she had when she was making a decision. "I think," she said, "that if a fire does come, and we're not prepared and we lose everything, I don't want to spend the rest of my life wishing we'd done something about it when we had the chance." "So you're in." "I didn't say I wasn't worried, but you're in." She stood up. "I'm going to bed. In the morning, we'll figure out the barriers." She took the lamp with her, leaving him sitting in the dark with the map. Outside, the night was dry and still, and the air smelled faintly of something, dust and heat, and the particular dryness of a summer that had given nothing and wasn't planning to start. To the west, the hills were dark shapes against a dark sky, silent and enormous and indifferent. Gideon sat for a while longer before he folded the map and went to bed. They started the next morning. It was the first week of July, and the temperature by mid-morning was already enough to make working in the sun feel like an argument you were losing. Gideon built temporary barriers out of scavenged wood and old fence wire. Nothing pretty, nothing permanent, just enough to channel the goats where he wanted them. Mara handled the salt, scattering it in the areas they needed cleared, learning quickly that the goats would go where the salt went, that they were much more manageable than she'd expected, that for all their sideways looks and appetite for anything that wasn't nailed down, they were, at their core, practical creatures who wanted food and would cooperate with the people who provided it. They started on the west side, the side facing the hills, the side that mattered most. The work was what Gideon had said it would be: hot, slow, and relentless. Moving barriers, scattering salt, checking progress at dusk and resetting in the morning. The goats cleared a strip 20 feet wide in 3 days, then another beside it, then another. A rough, uneven perimeter was beginning to take shape around the western side of the property. Not clean, not impressive to look at, nothing like the orderly operation of a successful ranch. Just bare ground and stubble and the smell of disturbed soil and goat in the baking summer heat. Neighbors rode past. A few stopped to look. Gideon would see them from the field, watching from horseback or from the road, and he'd nod and wave and go back to work. A couple of them asked what he was doing. He told them, straight and without embarrassment, and watched their faces run through the sequence: confusion, then dawning comprehension, then the particular expression of a person deciding not to say what they're actually thinking. "That's an interesting approach," one man said. "Appreciate you sharing that," said another. Both of them rode on. By the end of July, the cleared perimeter ran all the way around the north and west sides of the property, ragged in places, inconsistent in others, but real. Gideon had extended it to nearly 40 feet in the most vulnerable spots, the places where the brush had been thickest and the wind tended to funnel down from the ridge. They were working on the south side when August came in. Hot. Dry. Windless, for the most part, which somehow felt worse than wind. Mara had stopped sleeping well. She lay awake some nights listening to the silence of the range, which should have been reassuring, but wasn't. The summer had been too dry. Everything was too dry. She'd grown up in Ohio, in farm country where summer meant green and rain and the smell of wet earth, and she'd spent 6 years trying to adjust to a land that did things differently, that made you earn whatever it gave you, and took it back without warning when it decided to. She lay awake and listened to the silence and tried not to think about fire. Then one night in early August, she thought she smelled smoke. She got up, went to the window, looked west. The sky above the ridgeline was the same dark sky it always was, stars across it in the way she'd never gotten used to after Ohio, the staggering quantity of stars that the western sky showed you when there were no clouds and no humidity to soften them. No orange, no glow. She stood at the window for a long time anyway. Then she went back to bed. But she didn't sleep. Again. They finished the south perimeter on the 7th of August. It wasn't as wide as Gideon would have liked. There were spots where they'd run short on time, where the goats hadn't cleared quite as thoroughly as the west side, where a strip of dry grass still ran closer to the fencing than he was comfortable with. He walked the line twice, looking for the worst patches, marking them in his head as places to address before the season got any older. He didn't get the chance. On the 12th of August, a fire started somewhere in the grasslands north of Torrance Creek, 20 miles west of the valley. Nobody knew exactly how it started. A lightning strike, some said. A coal from a campfire. Sparks from a wagon wheel on dry stone. In the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was the wind that came up that afternoon. A hard, dry wind out of the northwest that took something manageable and made it into something else entirely. Mara was in the barn when she smelled it, not faint this time. Not the ghost of smoke she'd imagined in the night. This was real and immediate and unmistakable. The thick, chemical smell of grass burning on a large scale. And when she stepped out of the barn and looked west, she saw the sky. It was orange, not the orange of sunset. Sunset was soft and gradual and retreated when you looked away. This orange was moving. This orange had a base of black underneath it, a churning darkness that was advancing across the ridgeline with a speed that made her stomach go hollow. She ran for the cabin. "Gideon!" she shouted. He was already coming out the front door. He'd seen it. They stood side by side in the yard and looked west. And for a few seconds, neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say that the sky wasn't already saying louder. The fire was still on the far side of the ridge. That was the only good news, and even that wasn't entirely good, because the ridge was not far and the wind was not slowing down. It came in hard gusts that bent the dry grass flat and carried the smell of smoke so thick it coated the back of Mara's throat when she breathed. "How long do we have?" she asked. Gideon was shading his eyes with his hand, watching the orange line above the hills. "An hour," he said. "Maybe less. Depends on the wind." "The cattle." "I'll move them to the east pasture, farthest from the fire line." He was already moving toward the barn. "You get the water barrels out, everything we have, and the feed sacks. Wet them down. Leave them near the barn door." "Gideon." "Mara." He stopped and turned. His face was tighter than she'd seen it in a long time. Not panicked. Gideon didn't panic, which was sometimes its own problem, but stripped down to something hard and focused. "We did the work. We laid the groundwork. Now we just have to execute it." She wanted to say, what if it's not enough? What if the gaps we left are too wide? What if the south strip is too thin? What if the wind shifts at the wrong moment and the fire jumps the barrier in 3 places at once? She didn't say any of it. "Water barrels," she said. "I've got it." He went for the cattle. She went for the barrels. The next 40 minutes were the most efficient either of them had ever worked, which was the particular kind of efficiency that terror produces. No wasted motion, no second guessing, no stopping to rest. Mara hauled water from the main well in buckets, filling 2 large barrels they'd positioned near the barn for exactly this reason. She soaked feed sacks and stacked them in a pile. She moved the chickens into the storm cellar under the house, which they went into with far less resistance than usual, as though even they understood something was wrong. She could hear the fire now. Not see it, not yet, but hear it. A low, constant roar underneath the wind, like the sound of a distant river, except rivers didn't move that fast and they didn't eat things. Gideon came back from the east pasture at a run, his shirt dark with sweat already. "Cattle are through," he said. "Gates latched." He grabbed a wet sack and looked at the sky. The orange had changed. It was brighter now and lower, and the smoke column had shifted south, which meant the wind was pushing it directly toward the valley. "We need to walk the line." They walked it together, moving fast along the inside edge of the fire break. It looked different now than it had during the weeks of slow, hot work. The bare strips of ground and stubble they'd spent all summer creating looked thinner and less significant than she'd remembered, though she knew that was fear talking. She forced herself to look at it plainly. West side, good. North side, good, maybe 40 feet wide in the widest places. South side. She stopped. There was a section near the corner where the south strip ran thin. They'd noticed it before, a spot where the goats had worked through it unevenly, where a line of dry grass still grew inside what should have been cleared ground. She'd meant to address it. They both had. The 12th of August had come before they got to it. "That section," she said. Gideon was already looking at it. The strip of uncleared grass was maybe 3 feet wide and 20 feet long, running parallel to the fence line, close enough to the barn's south wall that she didn't like it. "I'll clear it now," he said. "With what? We don't have time for the goats." "By hand." He looked around, spotted the scythe leaning against the fence post where he'd left it 2 days ago. He grabbed it. "Go check the east side. Make sure the goats are away from the fire line." She went. The goats? Their 41 peculiar, crooked-horned, rope-chewing, garden-destroying goats. had already moved themselves to the far end of the north pasture, huddled against the interior fence in a way that animals do when something in the air tells them to get away from the open. They were making noise, a constant, restless sound, but they were clear of the break. When she came back, Gideon had cut half the rogue grass strip down. He was swinging hard and fast, the kind of work that cost more than it looked like, and sweat was running off his jaw. She picked up the rake leaning against the same fence post and started raking the cut grass away from the fence line, throwing it east, away from the danger side. They finished the strip with maybe 15 minutes to spare. The fire came over the ridge just before 4 in the afternoon. Mara saw it fully for the first time from the yard, and the scale of it did something to her thinking that she couldn't entirely describe. She'd seen prairie fires before. Small ones, contained ones, the kind that burned a few acres and got stopped by a creek or a road. This was not that. This was a wall. A moving, churning wall of orange and black that stretched along the ridgeline for what looked like miles in both directions, and it was coming down the western slope with a speed that made the ground seem to lean toward it. The roar was tremendous. Not the river sound she'd heard earlier. This was something bigger and more violent. The sound of everything dry and combustible on the western slope being consumed at once. The sound of 50 years of accumulated deadwood and thorn brush and dried grass all going up in less time than it took to describe it. "Inside the line," Gideon said. "Stay inside the line." They stood near the barn and watched it come. The fire reached the base of the slope and spread into the north pasture beyond their property, the unfenced rangeland that bordered their claim on the west. It took that ground in less than 10 minutes, which seemed impossible until you watched it happen. The grass went up like paper. The thorn brush went up like it had been waiting for permission. The fire moved fast enough that you could track its progress against fixed points. It passed the stone outcrop on the northwest corner of the range in 2 minutes, then reached the old dry creek bed in 2 more. The creek bed that should have slowed it down and didn't because there was nothing in it except baked mud and rock. "It's moving north," Mara said. Wind shifted a little. Gideon watched. "It's going to catch the fence line and turn south. See how it's following the slope?" He pointed. She saw it. The fire was running along a natural channel in the terrain, the way water would if there were any, pulling south toward the valley floor, toward the cluster of ranches, toward their place. "The Carver spread is going to catch it," she said. The Carver property was directly north of theirs, 160 acres with a solid barn and a 2-story house that Dan Carver had spent 3 years building. She'd been at a supper there 4 months ago. Dan's wife had a collection of china dishes that she kept on a shelf above the kitchen stove. The fire hit the Carver north fence line, and she watched the fence go, posts and wire, gone in seconds. And then the fire poured through onto the Carver property like something that had been waiting to be invited in. The barn caught before the house did, which was unusual enough that it registered even through everything else. The hay barn went all at once, a single enormous orange shape that bloomed up against the black sky, and the roar of it reached her a second later, a physical sound that she felt more than heard. Gideon's hand found her arm. "Look at the line," he said quietly. She looked. The fire was spreading south and east across the valley floor, eating the grass and brush that lay between the Carver place and their western perimeter. She could see the edge of their fire break from here, the bare scraped earth, the stubble, the 40-foot wide nothing that they'd spent all summer creating one rope length of goats at a time. The fire reached it, and she held her breath. It slowed, not stopped, not yet, but slowed. The roaring, aggressive spread that had taken the Carver barn in 30 seconds hit the bare strip and lost its momentum, the way a running man loses speed on sand. The flames dropped lower. She could see individual tongues of fire probing at the edge of the cleared ground, finding nothing to sustain them, pulling back. "It's working," she said. She said it quietly, like she didn't want to jinx it. "It's working on the north side," Gideon said. "Keep watching." The south side was where it got bad. The fire had circled, or rather, the wind had shifted again. A hard gust that pushed a finger of flame southeast, running along a low depression in the ground that they hadn't fully accounted for when they'd planned the perimeter. It hit the section of their south property line, and when Mara looked, her stomach dropped. There was grass burning inside the break. Not much. A small tongue of fire that had jumped the outer edge through a gap she couldn't see from here. catching a tuft of dry grass that had apparently survived the work she and Gideon had done. But a small tongue of fire in August in Wyoming was not something that stayed small. She watched it spread 3 feet in 30 seconds. "South side," she said. Gideon had already seen it. He grabbed a wet sack and was running before she finished the words. She grabbed another and ran after him. The heat was incredible. Not from the south fire, that was still small, but from the main fire burning to their west and north, 40, 50 feet away from where she was running, close enough that the air shimmered and her lungs ached with it. Smoke was everywhere, the thick choking kind that sat low and made the world shrink down to 20 feet of visibility. Gideon reached the burning patch and started beating it with the wet sack, hard and flat, each stroke deliberate. She came in from the other side and did the same. The fire tried to go around them. She saw it catch another piece of grass to her left, and she beat that down, then turned back to the original patch, then went left again. It was not efficient. It was not organized. It was 2 people in smoke and heat trying to keep a small fire from becoming a big fire, switching between spots, losing ground for a moment, and then recovering it. Neither of them saying anything because there wasn't breath for talking. At some point, Gideon's sack caught a spark, and a corner of it started burning, and he threw it down and stamped it out with his boot, and then kept stamping at the grass fire with his boot because the sack was ruined. She kept going with hers. He found a half-full bucket near the fence post, water she'd left out during the preparation, and poured it over a section she'd been struggling to beat back, and the fire hissed and shrank. They were there for 20 minutes, though it felt like a different and much longer amount of time. When it was over, when the last patch of ground fire was out, and she'd walked the full length of the south side twice with her eyes on the ground, looking for any trace of smoke, she sat down on the bare earth with her back against the fence post and put her hands on her knees and just breathed. Gideon sat next to her. His right sleeve was burned through. There was a blister rising on the back of his hand where something had caught him. She hadn't seen it happen. "Your hand," she said. He looked at it. "Yeah. That needs cold water." In a minute, they sat. Around them, the smoke was thick and the roar of the main fire was still everywhere, still enormous, still moving. But moving east, she realized. Moving away from them. The fire had passed their south perimeter, unable to get a foothold in the cleared ground, and had continued its course south and east, toward other properties, other barns, other families who had not spent the summer working behind goats. The thought sat heavily with her. "The Mercer spread is east of us," she said. "I know. He's got a lot of dry grass around those barns." Gideon didn't say anything. A sound came from somewhere to the south. Not the roar of fire, which was different, but the sharp crack of something structural giving way. A beam, maybe. Or a wall. Far enough that she couldn't tell whose. She looked at Gideon. He was looking at his burned hand. "We need to check the north line again," he said. "Make sure nothing came through while we were on the south side." She got up. Her legs were shakier than she expected. She ignored it. "I'll take the north. You get your hand in water first." He started to argue. "Gideon!" She said it the same quiet way she'd said it months ago in the yard, the day he came home with the goats. The tone that meant this isn't a discussion. Water. Then the north line. He went. The north line held. She walked it twice in the smoke-thick dusk, stepping carefully, watching for any trace of heat or smolder in the bare ground. The firebreak was ugly, uneven, irregular, a patchwork of cleared earth and stubble that looked nothing like the orderly defensive line she'd imagined during those early planning conversations at the kitchen table. But it had done what they'd built it to do. The fire had hit it and turned. She could see the blackened ground on the outer side, the scorched fence posts at the perimeter's edge, the place where the fire had pushed against the barrier and found nothing to feed on. She stopped at the northwest corner and looked out at what had been the Carver Range. It was black, completely black, still smoking in places, the charred stumps of fence posts standing in rows like broken teeth. The Carver barn was gone. She could see the foundation stones from here, and the twisted metal of what had been the weather vane lying in the ash. The house was still standing, but with what damage she couldn't tell yet. She stood there for a while, looking at it. Then she walked back to find Gideon. He was at the water barrel with his hand submerged, doing what she'd told him to do, which was unusual enough under the circumstances that she filed it away. He looked up when she approached. "Line's good," she said. He let out a breath. They stood by the water barrel in the smoky dusk and looked at their property. The cabin, the barn, the fences, the south pasture where the goats were beginning to move again now that the immediate noise had settled. Everything standing, everything intact except for Gideon's hand and a corner fence post on the south side that had scorched through and would need replacing. It was not a triumphant feeling exactly. There was too much smoke in the air for triumph, too many sounds of damage coming from the surrounding valley, too many orange glows still visible to the east where the fire was continuing its work on properties that didn't have what theirs had. Mara kept thinking about Dan Carver's wife and her china dishes on the shelf above the stove. She kept thinking about the Mercer spread east of them, which by now was probably... She stopped the thought before it finished. "We should check on the neighbors in the morning," she said. "Yeah. People are going to need help." "Yeah." He pulled his hand out of the water and looked at the blister. It was not small. "Mara." "What?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the thinking kind of quiet. Something else. The kind of quiet that comes after something happens that you've been preparing for so long that its arrival feels both expected and impossible. "We made it," he said. It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd write down. But she understood what was in it. All the months of heat and ridicule and scavenged fence wood and salt and ropes and the goats' flat, stupid, patient faces and Brock Mercer's pitying smile and the women in the general store not bothering to be quiet and the night she'd lain awake smelling phantom smoke. She sat down on the edge of the water trough. "We made it," she said. Above them, the smoke moved east on the wind, and the stars began to appear at the edges of the clear sky, and somewhere out in the north pasture, one of the goats made its particular argumentative sound, which was either a complaint or a commentary, and under the circumstances, Mara thought it might have been both. The night was long. Neither of them slept much. They took turns walking the perimeter in 2-hour shifts, checking for any smolder that might have crept under the soil line, any ember that had landed somewhere in the dark, and was waiting for wind to wake it up. The main fire had moved east and south, its glow visible on the horizon like a second sunset that refused to quit. By midnight it was farther away, but the smoke stayed, settled low across the valley in a gray blanket that smelled like everything that had been lost. Gideon wrapped his burned hand in a strip of cloth soaked in the coolest water they had and went out for the second shift at 2 a.m. Mara sat at the kitchen table and tried to drink a cup of coffee and found she couldn't. She kept listening. The valley had gone quiet in a way that felt wrong. Not the natural quiet of a summer night, but the stunned quiet of a place that has just taken a hard blow and hasn't figured out yet what it means. She went out and walked the line herself, even though it wasn't her shift. Everything held. The bare earth of the firebreak was cold and undisturbed under her boots, the scorched outer edge of it still faintly warm in places when she crouched and put her palm close. On the western side of the barrier, the destruction was absolute. Black ground, charred posts, the ghost outlines of brush that had burned so completely there was almost nothing left. On the inside, her side, the ground was intact, dusty, ordinary. She stood at the northwest corner for a while and looked north toward the Carver property. No light in the house windows. Either they'd gotten out in time or they'd sheltered somewhere away from it. She hoped it was the first thing. Dawn came gray and ash-colored, the sun a pale disk behind a sky still thick with smoke. When it was light enough to see clearly, Mara and Gideon stood at the edge of their property and looked out at the valley, and what they saw was a different valley than the one that had existed the day before. The grass was gone. Not thinned, not burned back. Gone. From the ridge to the valley floor, from the western hills to a ragged line that ran east and bisected the rangeland into before and after. The creek bed they could see from the high point of their north pasture was a dark scar in a dark landscape. Fence lines had vanished. In the middle distance, 2 stone chimneys stood alone where a farmhouse had been, the walls collapsed and the roof ash, the chimneys just standing there in the open air with nothing to hold up anymore. Gideon counted the chimneys for a moment without speaking. "That's the Whitfield place," he said. "Yes." "They had 4 kids." "Yes." He was quiet. The burned hand was wrapped and hanging at his side, and he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at the chimneys. His jaw was doing the thing it did. "We should hitch the wagon," Mara said. Give me 20 minutes. He went to the barn. She went inside to pack what she could. 2 loaves of bread she'd baked 2 days ago, a side of cured pork, a clean shirt of Gideon's that was too big but might fit someone, bandaging cloth, a jar of the salve she used for burns, which seemed suddenly more necessary than it had yesterday. She moved quickly, not letting herself think too hard about the list of what their neighbors had lost, because if she started thinking about that specifically, she wouldn't be useful to anyone. She was wrapping the bread when she heard the first wagon on the road. Then a second. She went to the door and looked out. There were people on the road, not 1 or 2, but a line of them, some in wagons, some on horseback, some just walking. Coming from the east, from the parts of the valley the fire hadn't reached. Coming toward the burned areas, toward what was left of the ranches they'd watched burn from their yard last night. Among them, she recognized faces. The Holt family from the East Road. Tom Pierce and his wife. The Lundqvist brothers who ran the feed operation in Hadley. People who had sat in the general store and laughed, quietly or not so quietly, about the Hales and their 41 goats. Coming now with wagons full of blankets and food and rope, because the county was doing what the county did when something went badly wrong, which was show up. She watched them pass on the road. Then she finished packing the bread and went to help Gideon with the wagon. The Carver family had gotten out. Dan Carver had seen the fire coming from the ridge while there was still time, and he'd moved his wife and 3 children and whatever they could throw in a wagon in under 10 minutes, which was fast enough. They'd made it to the Pierce place on the East Road and spent the night there. When Gideon and Mara found them that morning, they were standing in the yard of the Pierce farm with the particular posture of people who have very recently survived something and are still sorting out how they feel about it. Dan Carver was a tall, quiet man who didn't talk much under normal circumstances. He looked at Gideon and Mara for a moment without saying anything. Then he said, "My barn's gone." "I know," Gideon said. "I'm sorry. Hay reserves too. All of it." He stopped. His wife was standing behind him with her hand on his arm, not saying anything either. "House is standing. Got some damage on the south wall, but the structure's there." "That's something. I suppose it is." Dan looked out at the road, at the smoke still rising here and there from the valley. The Whitfields lost everything, buildings, animals, the lot. Roy Whitfield got his hand burned pulling his youngest out of the barn before the roof went. Mara thought about Roy Whitfield. She'd spoken to him twice. He had big hands and a careful way of listening when someone talked to him. "What about Mercer?" Gideon asked. He said it carefully, without inflection. Dan was quiet for a moment. "Lost 2 barns. The big hay barn on the north side went completely. 3 years of stored reserve gone. Main house is standing, some of the outbuildings. His cattle made it, most of them. He had the hands drive them east when they saw the fire coming." A pause. "He didn't lose everything, but he lost plenty." Gideon nodded. He didn't say anything about that. They spent the morning moving between properties. The Whitfield family needed the most. Roy's burned hand needed proper attention, the kind that Mara's salve was a temporary measure for, and their 2 youngest children were in a state of shock that showed itself as unusual quietness rather than crying, which Mara found harder to look at than crying would have been. They had nothing left on the property except ash and 2 stone chimneys and a root cellar that had survived because it was underground. Mara sat with Margaret Whitfield in the yard of a neighbor's farm where they'd taken shelter, while the men talked logistics nearby. Margaret was a woman of about 40, raw-boned and practical, not given to sentiment. She had a cut on her forearm from something she'd run into during the evacuation, and she kept looking at it as though she'd just noticed it. "I left my mother's quilt," Margaret said, without particular emotion. "I had time to grab things, and I grabbed the wrong things. I kept thinking about the animals and the feed, and I forgot the quilt." Mara didn't say anything immediately. She sat with that for a moment. "Where's your mother now?" she asked. "Gone. 3 years ago. It was the only thing I had of hers." Margaret looked at her arm. "Silly thing to think about." "It's not silly. There's a house to rebuild and a whole winter to prepare for, and I'm thinking about a quilt." "You can think about more than one thing at a time," Mara said. "It's allowed." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Mara directly, the kind of look that had something else behind it. "Your place stood," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't entirely not one either. "Yes." How? And Mara told her. Not defensively, not with any flourish, just plainly. The goats, the fire break, the months of slow work in the summer heat, the temporary barriers and the salt, and the mornings and evenings spent walking the line. She told it the way you tell something that you're still half surprised worked, which was the truth of it. Margaret listened without interrupting. When Mara finished, Margaret was quiet for a moment. Everybody laughed about those goats, she said. I know. I laughed about those goats? Mara looked at her. I know that too. Margaret didn't apologize, which Mara appreciated. An apology would have been uncomfortable and beside the point. Instead, she just sat with what Mara had told her, turning it over, the way a practical woman processes information that changes something she'd already decided. You think it would work for other properties, Margaret said. I think it would depend on the land, but yes, I think it could. The days after the fire had a particular texture, ash-gray and exhausting, full of work that was the wrong kind of work, the kind you do after a loss rather than toward a gain. People were in shock in the slow way, not the dramatic way. They were going through motions, clearing what could be cleared, assessing what could be assessed, trying to put numbers to damage that was hard to put numbers to. Gideon's burned hand gave him trouble for several days. He couldn't grip properly, which meant Mara took on more of the physical work around their own place while he managed what he could with his left hand and compensated with what he called stubbornness, and she called a refusal to acknowledge basic anatomy. They didn't argue about it directly. They worked around it, which was how they'd handled most things for 6 years. On the third day after the fire, people started coming to the Hale property. The first was Dan Carver. He came in the afternoon alone on horseback, and he stopped his horse at their gate and called out for Gideon the way a man does when he's not entirely sure of his welcome. Gideon was in the yard. Come in, Dan. Dan tied his horse and came into the yard with his hat in his hands, which was a posture that didn't come naturally to him. He was a man who stood straight and direct and didn't typically do a lot of hat holding. I want to see it, he said. If you'll show me. The break? Yeah. So Gideon showed him. They walked the perimeter together, all the way around, and Gideon explained it. The sections, the width, how they'd moved the goats systematically, how the salt worked, which parts had cleared well and which parts had been harder, the south section that had nearly cost them everything. Dan walked quietly and listened, which was his way. At the northwest corner, the corner where you could see clearly the division between the burned outer land and the intact inner land, the clean line that the firebreak had held, Dan stopped and looked for a long moment. I could see your place from the Pierce farm, he said. During the night. You could see the fire around it, everything burning except this one piece. I know, Gideon said. I thought it was luck. A pause. I didn't know about any of this? Nobody asked. Dan turned his hat in his hands once. I owe you an apology, Gideon, for the goat business. I was one of the people who... He stopped, apparently finding the sentence difficult to finish. I wasn't kind about it. You weren't mean either, Gideon said. You just thought we were wrong. I did think that. You weren't alone. Dan looked at him with the particular expression of a man deciding whether he's being let off the hook or not. He seemed to conclude that it didn't matter because what he said next was practical rather than emotional, which was also his way. I've got my land still, the house, the west pasture, the creek field. No hay and no barn, but the land's there. He put his hat back on. If I rebuilt the barn first and then spent the fall, I could get goats. I don't know anything about them. I know a few things, Gideon said. Something passed between them. Not warmth exactly, not the easy warmth of long friendship, but the solid handshake warmth of two men arriving at a useful agreement. I'll come back when I've got the barn walls up, Dan said. If that's all right. That's all right. Tut. After Dan, there was Tom Pierce. Then two of the Lundqvist brothers, who came together and stood side by side the way they always did, asking questions in the efficient, overlapping way of people who've worked together for decades. Then Margaret Whitfield, who came without Roy because Roy's hand still needed daily attention, but she came with a notebook and wrote things down. Mara handled most of these conversations herself. Not because Gideon couldn't, but because she had a different facility for the teaching part. She was precise in a way that Gideon wasn't, could break down what they'd done into steps that made sense to someone who hadn't done it, could anticipate the practical questions and answer them before they were asked. She did it without performance. She didn't smooth it over or make it sound easier than it was. When Margaret asked how hard the summer work had been, Mara told her, hard. Hotter than you'd expect and slower than you'd want, and there were days when it seemed like an enormous amount of effort for something that might never matter. Did you doubt it? Margaret asked. Mara thought about that honestly. I doubted it the whole time, she said. I just thought doubting it wasn't a reason to stop. On the fourth day, 2 families from the south end of the valley came that Mara barely knew. People whose land had escaped the fire, but whose neighbors hadn't. People who had watched the smoke column from their porches and understood, maybe for the first time, that they were not immune. They were polite, and they asked careful questions, and one of the wives touched the cleared earth of the fire break with the toe of her boot and said nothing for a moment, just looked at it. On the 5th day, Brock Mercer's ranch foreman came. Not Mercer himself. His foreman, a flat-faced man named Cushman who'd worked for Mercer for 15 years and had the manner of someone who'd learned long ago to deliver his employer's messages without revealing his own opinions about them. He came to the gate and asked to speak with Gideon. Mr. Mercer would like to know, Cushman said, if you'd be willing to come out to his property and walk his land. Gideon looked at him. For what purpose? To look at the damage and to offer any advice on how to prevent similar damage in future. A pause. Those are his words. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Tell him I'll come Thursday, he said. Cushman nodded and rode back the way he came. Mara had been close enough to hear the conversation. She waited until Cushman was down the road. You're going to go, she said. Yes. He's never once... I know what he's never done. Gideon looked at her. But he's still a neighbor. He lost 2 barns. He's got people working for him who lost more than that. He paused. I'm going to go. She didn't argue. She wasn't sure she wanted to. Thursday came dry and still, the way all days were coming now. The valley locked in the aftermath of the fire, all that burned ground radiating heat, the smoke long gone, but the landscape still foreign, still wrong-looking. Gideon rode to the Mercer property alone. The damage was significant, but not total, the way Dan Carver had described. 2 barns were gone, one of them a structure Gideon had seen before, massive and well-built, the kind of barn that represented years of investment and serious money. The hay reserves stored in it were ash. Sections of fence were down across the northern range, and in places the ground was still faintly warm underfoot. Brock Mercer was waiting for him in the yard of the main house. He looked different than Gideon had ever seen him. Not smaller, exactly. Mercer was physically the same, still a big man who took up space comfortably. But something in his bearing was altered. The easy confidence, the slightly amused quality he carried like a garment, was absent. What was underneath it was not weakness. It was more like exposure, like a man who'd had something stripped away and hadn't yet decided how to stand without it. Gideon, he said. Brock. They shook hands, which they'd done before in a perfunctory way. This time it was slower. Thank you for coming, Mercer said. You asked. They walked the property together. Mercer showed him the damage without commentary, without the defensive justifications or the bragging tallies of what had survived that Gideon might have expected. He just walked and showed. Gideon looked at the land, the terrain, the way the fire had moved through it based on the burn patterns, the places where a cleared barrier might have stopped the spread or redirected it. He said what he thought, plainly, without softening it to protect anyone's feelings, and without sharpening it to make a point. He told Mercer where the vulnerability was, where the fire had found its opening, what the ground around the barns would need to look like before next fire season. Mercer listened. He didn't interrupt, which was unusual. He was not typically a man who listened without participating. When Gideon finished, they were standing near the foundation stones of the north hay barn, the ash still gray and fine, lifting slightly when the breeze moved. I had 3,000 acres, Mercer said. I thought that was security. Gideon didn't say anything. I thought you were foolish, Mercer said. I want you to know I'm aware that I was wrong about that. I know you thought it. I said it too, more than once. A pause. I pushed hard to buy your land. You did. I thought I was doing you a kindness. He said it without the protective irony it might have carried in the past. without the smoothness. I genuinely thought your operation was failing and that I was offering you a decent way out. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't just being predatory, I really believed your land wasn't viable. Gideon considered that for a moment. There was something disarming about a man admitting not just that he was wrong, but the specific shape of how he'd been wrong. I know, Gideon said. Most people believed it. And you still didn't sell. No. Mercer looked at the ash. Why not? The question was genuine, not rhetorical, not a setup for something. Gideon thought about it. Because it was ours, he said. And because giving up on it before we'd tried everything felt worse than failing. Mercer was quiet for a moment. I'd like your help, he said. Your advice on restructuring the grazing land, the perimeter. I'll pay for your time. You don't need to pay me. I'd like to. Brock. Gideon looked at him steadily. I'm not doing it for money. I'm doing it because you're a neighbor and the valley needs to rebuild, and having your operation back to full strength is better for everyone around you, including me. He paused. That's the only reason. Mercer held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. It was a different kind of nod than Gideon had ever seen from him. No subtext, no calculation. Just acknowledgement. All right, he said. They walked back toward the house. The burned ground was strange underfoot, the ash fine as dust, and somewhere in the north section, a single fence post was still standing with about 4 feet of wire attached to it, going nowhere, the rest of the line gone. Those goats of yours, Mercer said, almost as an afterthought. What about them? They still ugly? Gideon looked at him. Something crossed Mercer's face that might, under certain conditions, have been called sheepish. Some of them, Gideon said. The one with the crooked horn is still crooked. Mercer made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but close enough that both of them recognized it for what it was, which was a beginning of something, or at least the end of something else. They shook hands again at Gideon's horse. Thursday next? Mercer said. Thursday next, Gideon said. He rode home in the late afternoon light, through the valley that was black and raw and going to take years to come back, through the ash smell that was already becoming familiar in a way he wished it wasn't. And when he came up the Dry Creek Road and saw his cabin and barn standing in their ring of cleared earth, he thought about what he'd said to Mercer. It was ours. That was it. That was the whole of it. Not wisdom, not strategy, just the particular stubbornness of a person who'd decided that something mattered and refused to let go of it before finding out what it was worth. He put his horse in the barn and went inside. Mara was at the table with a lamp burning. She had the map spread out, not their property map, but a larger one she'd drawn herself in the past few days, showing the valley, all the ranches, the terrain features. She had marks on it in pencil, notes he couldn't read from the door. How did it go? She asked, without looking up. Better than I expected, he said. She looked up then, studied his face the way she did. Good, she said. She looked back at the map. I've been thinking about the Whitfield property. The terrain there is different from ours. The slope runs the other direction, so the fire risk comes from the south, not the west. The break would need to be structured differently. He came and looked at the map over her shoulder. You've been busy, he said. Somebody has to be. She tapped the map. Sit down. I want you to look at this. He sat down. Outside, the valley was dark and quiet, the stars appearing one by one in a sky that still held the faint ghost of smoke at its edges. And in the north pasture, one of the goats let out its familiar sound, half complaint, half observation, which carried in the still air all the way to the cabin window, clear as anything. The map Mara had drawn became the most referenced document in the valley that fall. She hadn't intended it that way. She'd drawn it for herself, the way she did most things, practically, because a problem was in front of her, and she needed to understand its shape before she could work on it. The valley's terrain, the fire corridors, the vulnerable approaches for each property depending on which direction the wind came from on a bad day. She'd spent 2 evenings on it while Gideon was out, penciling in the ranch boundaries she knew by memory, the creek lines, the ridge contours. She'd added notes in the margins about which properties had the most accumulated dry brush, which ones sat in natural wind channels. When Dan Carver came back the following week to talk about goats, he saw it on the table and asked to look at it. When Tom Pierce came 2 days after that, He stood over it for 15 minutes without saying much. When Margaret Whitfield came the next Thursday with Roy, whose hand was healing badly and slowly, Roy looked at the map and then looked at his wife and said, "You should have Mara talk to everyone at once." "What do you mean?" Mara said. "I mean, instead of each person coming out here one by one and asking the same questions, you get everyone together and you go through it properly." Roy's voice was the careful voice of a man managing pain without drawing attention to it. "The Carver place has room. Dan won't mind." "That's Dan's decision." "I'll ask Dan," Roy said. She looked at Gideon. He was looking at the map. "It makes sense," he said. "I know it makes sense," she said. "I just wasn't planning to stand up in front of the whole county and half the county," Gideon said. "Maybe less. That's not the reassuring correction you think it is." They held the meeting at the Carver farm on a Saturday afternoon in late August, 3 weeks after the fire. Dan had cleared the inside of his damaged barn enough to make it usable. The walls were standing, the south wall showing char damage at the base, the roof open in one corner where a beam had given way. He'd put boards across the floor joists where it was needed and moved in a collection of chairs and crates that represented most of what the attending families owned in the way of seating. 23 families came. Mara had not expected 23 families. She stood at the front of the barn with her map. She'd redrawn it larger. On 3 pieces of paper she'd joined with paste, the whole valley laid out with enough detail to be useful. And she looked at the people sitting in front of her and felt something she would have described, if pressed, as the specific discomfort of being taken seriously by people who had recently not taken you seriously at all. Some of them had laughed about the goats. She could see it in the way a few of them held themselves, the careful neutrality, the not quite meeting her eyes. Some of them were too burned down to carry anything extra. The Whitfield family sat together near the back, Roy with his bandaged hand in his lap, both of them with the hollow look that people get when exhaustion has been going on longer than the body expected. Gideon sat off to the side, not at the front with her, which was deliberate on his part. He'd said the night before that this was her plan, and she should present it. And she'd argued that they'd done it together, and it should be both of them. And he'd said he'd be there if she needed him and left it at that, which was occasionally infuriating and occasionally the right call. She started without preamble. "I'm going to explain what we did and why," she said. "Not to tell anyone they should have done the same thing. You didn't know what we were doing, and honestly, we weren't certain it would work either. I'm going to explain it because the fire is going to come back." The barn was quiet. "Not necessarily next year," she said. "Maybe not for 5 years. But this valley is dry land with dry summers and dry brush, and it's going to burn again, and the question is whether we're prepared for it when it does." She walked them through the map first. The terrain, the fire corridors, how the August fire had moved based on the wind and the slope. She could see people recognizing things, the path the fire had taken through their own property, the places where it had slowed or jumped, the reasons it had done what it did. Understanding why a disaster happened is a particular kind of relief even when the disaster is past. Then she explained the fire break. All of it. The goats, the systematic movement, the barriers, the salt. She explained the gaps, the parts that had nearly failed, the south section that she and Gideon had beaten out with wet sacks in the smoke. She didn't make it sound easier than it had been or smarter than it had started. It had started as a feeling Gideon had, and an old man's story on a dusty road, and a lot of hot, miserable work that the county had found ridiculous. "The ridiculous part worked," she said. "That's what I'm here to tell you." A woman near the middle, she recognized her as Helen Forsyth, whose family's property had survived on the far east side of the valley, raised her hand. "How many goats do you need? For a property the size of ours?" "Depends on the acreage and what you're clearing," Mara said. "We have 180 acres. 41 goats was enough for the perimeter we needed, with enough time. If you have less time, you need more goats. If your brush is heavier..." "Where do you get goats?" someone else said. Not hostile, just practical. "Anywhere livestock auctions happen, goats go cheap. They're not cattle, they're not horses, they're not prestige animals. Most people don't want them." She paused. "That's useful to us." There was a sound in the barn that wasn't quite laughter, but wasn't not laughter either. Tom Pierce spoke up from the left side. He was a deliberate man who chose his words the way a careful craftsman chose his tools. "My north pasture is mostly clear already. I've been running it hard for 5 years. But the east side, where it meets the ridge approach, that's all thorn brush. I've been meaning to clear it for 2 seasons and haven't." He looked at the map. "That's where I'd need the break." "Then that's where you start," Mara said. They went on like that for an hour. Specific questions, specific answers, people standing up to point at the map where their land was and describe their terrain, and Mara working through each case, not always with certainty. She said more than once, "I don't know. We'd have to look at it," but working through it with the practical patience of someone who'd spent all summer getting her hands into the problem. Gideon watched from the side. He watched her find her footing in the first 10 minutes and settle into it, watched the room shift from politely attentive to genuinely engaged. Watch the specific quality of attention that happens when people understand that what they're hearing might save something they care about. He also watched Brock Mercer, who had come late and was standing at the back near the barn doors with his hat in his hands. Mercer didn't ask any questions. He just listened, with a particular stillness that Gideon read as the attentiveness of a man who has recently been surprised by something and is working to recalibrate. After the meeting, people stayed longer than they'd planned to, the way they do when a gathering finds a purpose. Small clusters forming near the map, comparing notes, asking each other about their own land. Dan Carver was talking to 2 of the South Valley families about the barn rebuild, not about fire prep, but just about the barn, about labor exchange, who had spare lumber and who needed help with framing. The valley knitting itself back together in the small functional ways, which was not dramatic but was real. Mara was folding the map when Mercer approached her. She had not spoken directly to Mercer since the day in the yard 2 years ago, when she told him they appreciated him riding out. She looked at him now with a neutrality that cost her something to maintain, because she was tired and her feet hurt, and she'd been talking for an hour. "That was well done," he said. "Thank you. I mean it. The way you laid it out. You're a good teacher." He said it without the smoothness, without the slightly patronizing quality his compliments had formerly carried. Just straight. "I've had good material to work with," she said. He nodded. He looked down at the folded map in her hands. "Gideon said he'd come back Thursday, to walk my land with me. I know. I'd like you to come too, if you're willing." A pause. "The terrain questions. You've got a better eye for them. I could see that today." She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. "Thursday." The fall came in gradually, the way it did in Wyoming. Not a sudden turn, but a slow cooling, the mornings getting their edge back, the light changing its angle. The burned land began to show the first faint signs of recovery, a sparse green ground cover coming up through the ash in places where the fire had burned quick and not too hot, the kind of new growth that follows destruction if the soil still has anything left in it. The work of helping neighbors establish their own fire breaks was slower than Mara had estimated in the barn, which she'd known it would be. Maps are clean, land is not. Every property had its complications, a particular slope, a water feature that changed the approach, a stretch of old-growth brush that had been there so long it had root systems that the goats couldn't fully address in a single season. She and Gideon spent 3 days at the Whitfield place in September. The Whitfields had nothing. What they had was their land and Roy's healing hand and Margaret's notebook and a determination that Mara found genuinely humbling, which was not a feeling she had easily or often. They'd borrowed 6 goats from a man in the South Valley who had more than he needed, and they were building their break on the south exposure, which was the most vulnerable approach. Roy worked alongside them despite the hand, doing what he could one-handed or left-handed, which meant he dropped things and knocked things over and cursed with a consistency and creativity that would have been funny under other circumstances. Margaret worked without complaint, which Mara was learning was her particular form of toughness, not loud, just uninterrupted. She moved the goats and reset the barriers and checked the cleared sections at dusk, and didn't stop until the light was gone. On the second evening, when the work was done for the day, and they were eating together in what had been cleared from the ruins of the Whitfield kitchen, a table salvaged, some chairs, a cook fire built in the open air where the east wall had been, Margaret poured coffee and said something that had apparently been sitting with her for a while. "I want you to know something," she said. She was looking at Mara, not about the fire prep, something else. Mara waited. "What you and Gideon did, the summer, the goats, all of it, people talked about it like it was luck. Even after everything, some people still say that you just got lucky with where your land sits. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. I want you to know I don't think that. I know you don't, Mara said. You were at the meeting. I'm saying it directly because I owe you that. Margaret looked at her levelly. I laughed about the goats. Not cruelly, not to be mean, but I thought you were wrong and I said so to other people and I was wrong about that. You deserve to hear me say it plainly. The cook fire made a small sound. Roy was looking at something across the ruined wall, giving them space in the way of a man who understands when a conversation isn't for him. Mara thought about what to say. She'd spent enough of the summer carrying the weight of other people's amusement that she could have said plenty. She'd rehearsed versions of it in her head on the bad days, the hotter days, the days when the work felt pointless and the goats were unmanageable, and she'd overheard something at the general store and driven home alone with her jaw set. But sitting here in the open-air kitchen of Margaret Whitfield's burned house, she found that what she'd rehearsed wasn't what she wanted to say. We didn't know it would work, she said. I want to be honest about that. Right up until the fire hit the barrier, I was not certain. I was afraid. You did it anyway. We didn't have a better option. She looked at her coffee. If you'd asked me in July whether I believed it was going to save us, I'd have told you I hoped it would. Hope and certainty aren't the same thing. Margaret was quiet. No, she said finally. They're not. Gideon's Thursday visits to the Mercer property had developed into something neither man had anticipated. It had started as practical consultation, walking the land, assessing terrain, advising on where the fire break should be structured and how wide it needed to run, given the Mercer property's specific vulnerabilities. But Mercer was not a man who stayed passive during a process. He asked questions, good questions, the kind that revealed he was thinking carefully rather than just going through the motions of being instructed. He pushed back when something didn't make sense to him, which Gideon appreciated because being pushed back at meant a man was actually listening. By the third Thursday, they were talking about more than fire breaks. They were walking the north section of the Mercer land, where the rebuild of the hay barn was underway. The frame already up, donated labor from 3 neighboring families, the whole thing rising faster than it would have if Mercer had been paying for all the work. That was how it went now, and not just for Mercer. The county was rebuilding collectively in a way it hadn't operated before the fire, a practical cooperation born out of necessity that had a side effect of making people more comfortable asking each other for things. I've been doing some thinking, Mercer said. They were looking at the new barn frame, the raw wood bright against the still dark ground. About next season. What about it? My herd is reduced, the North Reserve is gone, and rebuilding that's going to take time. I'm looking at a leaner operation for at least 2 years. He was quiet for a moment. I've also been thinking about what you said, about acquiring cattle at a fair price. Gideon looked at him sidelong. I didn't say that to you, he said. No, you said it to yourself apparently, where other people could hear it. A very dry pause. Dan Carver told me. Don't be annoyed with Dan. He meant well. Gideon wasn't annoyed with Dan. He was mildly surprised, which was different. I've been wanting to expand my herd for 2 years, he said. Our cattle losses from the drought left us at 38 head. We're not viable long-term at that number. I know. I've watched your operation. Mercer said it without judgment, just as a statement of observation. I have 40 head I'm looking to move before winter. Quality stock. I'm reducing strategically, not from desperation. I'd rather sell to someone who's going to manage them well than take them to the auction and get whatever the auction gives me. He named a price. To us, Gideon did math in his head quickly. The summer's survival meant the savings were intact. It was a fair price, genuinely fair, not the loaded generosity of a man trying to purchase goodwill, just a reasonable number for good cattle. Why me? Gideon said. Mercer looked at him. Because you're the best manager in the valley right now, and I'm not saying that to flatter you. You made something work that nobody else thought to try, and you kept your operation solvent when 3 larger ones failed. Those are the facts. He looked back at the barn frame. Also, honestly, because I owe you. Not for the cattle price, that's business, but for the other things. It was the most direct thing Mercer had ever said to him. Gideon looked at the barn frame for a while. I'll take the 40 head, he said. October moved them all toward winter with the relentless indifference of a Wyoming fall, which didn't care about damage assessments or emotional reckonings and arrived on its own schedule regardless. The valley was in better shape than it had any right to be, given August. Not good. There were still properties that were operating on borrowed capacity, still families in temporary situations, still a raw quality to the landscape that the first frosts would preserve rather than erase. But the barns were going up. The hay that hadn't burned was being shared and carefully rationed. The goats, not just Gideon and Mara's goats, but the borrowed and purchased goats on 5 other properties now, were still working, being moved through the fall brush clearing with the same steady, unglamorous efficiency that had characterized the whole enterprise from the beginning. The county's relationship to the Hales had changed. It hadn't changed with a speech or a ceremony or anything formal. It had changed the way most real things change, incrementally, through small accumulated moments that add up to something different than what was there before. People who had been casually unkind in the summer were now casually respectful, and in some cases genuinely warm, though they didn't necessarily acknowledge the transition directly. That was fine. Mara wasn't keeping score, or not the kind of score that needed to be settled. She was at the general store on a Thursday in October when she overheard 2 men she didn't know well, newcomers to the county relatively, been there only a year, talking near the hardware section. One of them said something about a ranching couple up on the North Road who'd figured out a way to keep their place safe in the fire. Something about goats. She kept her eyes on the shelf in front of her. "The Hale place," the other man said. "You know, Gideon Hale, his wife too. They spent the whole summer on it. Smart people. Real smart. And the goats thing, I heard from Dan Carver the methodology is something you can apply to any property if you do it right. They've been helping people set it up." "I heard that too. You should talk to them." She picked up her flour and her lamp oil and paid for them and went out to the wagon. She sat in the wagon seat for a moment before she picked up the reins. The street was the same street. The hardware porch had the same men on it, different assortment. The sky was October blue, the aspens on the hills behind town showing their yellow. She picked up the reins and drove home. Gideon was in the south pasture moving fence sections when she got back. She could see him from the road, his figure against the pale afternoon light, methodical, unhurried, doing the same unglamorous work that constituted most of a ranch life. She pulled the wagon to the barn and started unloading. He came in from the pasture about 20 minutes later and helped her with the last of it without being asked. "How was town?" he said. "Fine," she said. Then, "I heard 2 men talking about us in the hardware section." He waited. "They didn't know I was there. They were saying good things." She set the flour on the shelf. "It's strange. Not bad strange, just strange." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good strange is still strange." "Yes. You'll get used to it." "I'm not sure I want to get used to it," she said. "I don't want to start expecting it. That seems like the wrong direction." He considered that with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "No," he said. "I think you're right about that." She looked at him. He had hay on his shirt from the pasture work, and the burned hand, mostly healed now, the blister resolved into a smooth scar on the back of his knuckles, was working normally again, or close enough. He looked like himself. He looked like a man who had spent his summer doing something other people thought was foolish and had turned out to be right about it, which had not made him arrogant or certain or anything like that. He just looked like himself. "Mercer's 40 head arrived Monday," she said. "I know. We're going to need to restructure the east pasture to handle the additional numbers. I've been thinking about that. And the water situation. With 40 more animals, we're going to need the second well running at full capacity before winter." "Already on the list." She nodded. Outside, the afternoon light was dropping, the shadows going long across the yard. In the north pasture, she could hear the goats. Their persistent, commentary-laden sound, neither musical nor annoying, just present. The sound that had been the sound of the summer, of the work, of the whole improbable chain of choices that had brought them to here. "We should feed them," she said. "The goats or the cattle?" "Both," she said. "Always both." She went to get the feed and he went to open the gate, and the work continued the way it always did. Not gracefully, not without difficulty, but forward. Mercer's 40 head arrived on a Monday morning, as promised. Gideon was at the gate before the sun was fully up, which was not unusual for him, but Mara noticed he'd been awake earlier than normal, moving around in the dark with the careful quiet of a man trying not to disturb anyone while also being unable to stay still. She'd lain in bed and listened to him and not said anything because she understood what it meant. This was the thing he'd been working toward for 2 years. Not the fire, not the recognition, not any of the things that had happened in the fall. The cattle. A viable herd. The original dream, the one that had been shrinking since the drought started, that he'd been watching diminish without ever quite saying out loud how much it cost him. She got up and made coffee and brought him a cup at the gate. He took it without looking away from the road. "Thank you," he said. They heard the cattle before they saw them. The low collective noise of a herd on the move, the sound of hooves on the dry road. Then they came around the bend. 40 head of good stock, Mercer's best breeding animals, driven by 2 of his hands who nodded at Gideon and Mara as they passed and said nothing unnecessary. Gideon watched them come through the gate and into the east pasture. He stood there for a while after the Mercer hands had gone, just watching the cattle settle into the new ground, doing what cattle do, moving apart, finding the grass, establishing the invisible social geometry of a herd in a new space. They were good animals. You could see it in how they moved, the quality of their frames, the way the led cow found the water trough without being directed. Mara watched him watch them. There was something in his face that she hadn't seen in a long time. Not happiness exactly. It was quieter than that, more internal. The look of a man whose interior accounting has finally come out even, after years of running short. She went back inside. He came in an hour later and ate breakfast and didn't say much, which was fine. Some things didn't need words. They'd been married long enough to know the difference between silence that was empty and silence that was full. Winter came hard that year, which Wyoming winters do when they feel like it, without regard for what the preceding season has already asked of people. The snow started in November and didn't stop in any meaningful way until March, and in between there were stretches of cold that found every gap in every barn wall and every weakness in every hay supply. The hail operation held, not without difficulty. The second well gave them trouble in January, a pump mechanism that froze twice and needed thawing each time with water they could barely spare. And there were 2 nights in February when the temperature dropped far enough that they lost 3 of the younger cattle, which hurt regardless of the fact that the herd was now large enough to absorb the loss. Loss is loss. You don't get philosophical about it when you're standing in a cold barn at 2 in the morning with an animal that's not going to make it. The goats, characteristically, were fine. They were built for difficult conditions in a way that made a person suspect the universe had considered the goat carefully before making it. Hardy, adaptable, argumentative about everything but not actually fragile about anything. Mara had developed an unwilling respect for them over the course of the year that she wouldn't have described as affection, but that functioned similarly in practical terms. She knew their individual personalities now. She knew which ones were reliable and which ones needed watching, and which one would absolutely find the one gap in any barrier she constructed, not out of malice, but out of what seemed like a principled commitment to testing boundaries. The crooked-horned one was still crooked-horned. Still, somehow, the first one out of any enclosure and the last one in. She'd stopped being annoyed by it. The valley rebuilt through the winter and into the spring with the particular determination of people who don't have the option of not rebuilding. The Whitfield barn went up in February, which was a bad time to be building in Wyoming, but Roy Whitfield had calculated that he needed the structure before spring calving, and so they built it in February. Neighbors showing up on the coldest days with tools and numb hands, the work going slower than it would have in better weather, the wood stiff and the nails harder to drive. It took 3 weekends instead of 1. When the last boards went on the roof, Margaret made a pot of stew large enough to feed everyone present, which she did over the open fire in the yard because the new kitchen wasn't finished yet, and they ate standing up in the cold and nobody complained. Mara was there for the last day of the build. She handed up boards and held things level and did what was needed, which was how she operated. She was not naturally a person who inserted herself into situations, but she'd learned over the past months that the county's recovery was not a spectator event, that the map she'd drawn and the meeting at the Carver barn and the hours spent walking other people's land had made her part of something whether she'd formally signed up for it or not. On the drive home from the Whitfield build, the sun already gone and the sky a deep winter blue, Gideon said something that had apparently been sitting with him. I keep thinking about something Eli Dawson said, back in July. About fire? About Prescott, the man who ran goats and was the only one who didn't lose his buildings. He was quiet for a moment, watching the road. He said everyone thought Prescott was lucky. I remember. We did everything Prescott did, maybe more. And still, even now, some people call it luck. He said it without bitterness, just as an observation. That's a strange thing about people. Mara thought about that. I think, she said slowly, that luck is what people say when they don't want to examine why something worked. Because if they examine it, they have to think about why they didn't do it. He considered that. That's not generous, he said. No, she agreed, but I think it's true. Sometimes luck is just luck. Sometimes it is, but this wasn't. She looked out the window at the dark hills. We made 100 small decisions over 4 months. Any one of them could have been different. We could have put the south perimeter lower on the list and never gotten to it. We could have built the barriers narrower. We could have sold to Mercer in the spring when he came with that paper. She paused. None of that was luck. It was just choosing over and over when it was easier not to. He drove for a while without answering. You're harder on people than I am, he said finally. I know. It's not always wrong. I know that too. Spring came. The burned ground showed its recovery more clearly now. The new grass coming up green and fine through the ash, which was better soil amendment than anyone would have chosen, but worked regardless. The fence lines were going back in across the valley, new posts and wire replacing what the fire had taken, the landscape slowly regaining its familiar grid of claimed and working land. In April, there was a second meeting at the Carver barn. This one had been Dan's idea, which surprised Mara a little, though maybe it shouldn't have. Dan Carver was a quiet man, but he was not a passive one. He'd watched the first meeting, and he'd watched how the winter had gone, and he'd concluded that what had begun as emergency response was worth formalizing into something more permanent. 31 families came this time. Mara stood at the front again with an updated map. She'd revised it through the winter, added new notes, incorporated what she'd learned from walking other people's land. She'd also brought something she hadn't had at the first meeting, a written summary of the firebreak methodology, 2 pages in her precise handwriting, enough detail that a person could follow it without her being there to explain. She distributed the pages before she spoke. People read them with the concentration of people receiving useful information, which was different from the polite attention she'd gotten in August. Something had shifted over the winter. She was not the woman with the ridiculous goats anymore, not even residually. She was the woman who had figured something out and was willing to share it, which was a different kind of standing and one that carried its own responsibilities. The meeting was practical and specific. Questions about goat sourcing, about the mechanics of different terrain types, about how to handle the spring brush regrowth that was already happening on the recovering land. Mercer attended and sat near the front and asked 3 questions, each one precise and well considered, contributing to the conversation rather than performing his way through it. He'd been different since the fall. Not entirely changed, because a man of 44 doesn't become an entirely different man, but recalibrated. The edges of him had been adjusted by something. Mara didn't spend time analyzing it. It was enough that it was useful. Near the end, Tom Pierce raised something that hadn't been on anyone's agenda. I want to suggest something, he said, for the group to consider. He was using his careful craftsman voice. What Gideon and Mara started here isn't just a fire plan. It's a way of operating, looking out for each other's land, sharing what works. I don't think it has to stop when the fire threat is addressed for this season. The barn was quiet, listening. I'm talking about a more regular arrangement, not formal, nothing with paperwork and dues and all of that. Just an understanding that we pool information on what's working and what isn't. That when someone needs help with their break or their land prep, we show up. He looked around the room. We've already been doing it. I'm just saying maybe we name it. A few people nodded. A few others looked thoughtful in the way that meant they were working through possible objections. Dan Carver said, I don't think it needs a name. I think it just needs to continue. Fair enough, Tom said. It continued, unnamed, which was probably right. The things that last in a community are rarely the ones with ceremonies attached to them. They're the ones that simply keep happening because enough people find them worth doing. By the summer, a full year after the fire, the valley had a different texture. Not better in all ways. There were still properties that were operating below their pre-fire capacity, still families whose financial recovery was going to take longer than one good season. Roy Whitfield's hand had healed, but not completely. He'd lost some grip strength on the right side that wasn't coming back, and he'd had to adjust the way he worked, which was an ongoing daily recalibration that he handled without complaint and without pretending it wasn't there. The Whitfield place was functional, and the new barn was standing, but they were not flush, and they knew it. No single summer fixes everything a bad summer broke. That's the reality of it. But the goat-cleared breaks were visible on half a dozen properties now. The bare earth perimeters that had seemed eccentric on one ranch looking like common sense on 6. The county had stopped laughing about goats, which had the side effect of goats becoming slightly harder to purchase cheaply at auction, since more people wanted them now. Gideon had noted this development with the dry satisfaction of a man who'd bought at the right time for the wrong reasons. He was in the south pasture in July, moving one of the temporary barriers with 2 of the Carver Farm's hired hands. Dan had sent them over for the day as labor exchange, when he saw a rider coming up the creek road. He didn't recognize the horse at first. When he did, he straightened up and looked. It was Eli Dawson. The old man rode in the way he did everything, without hurry, at his own pace, as though time was something that other people worried about. He pulled up near the fence line and sat his horse, looking at the south pasture and its cleared perimeter with the expression of a man reviewing work he'd had some indirect hand in. Gideon walked over. Eli, Gideon. The old man looked at the cleared break. Then he looked at the Carver hands working nearby, at the goats in the adjacent pasture, at the general functioning evidence of a ranch in summer operation. You've been busy. Staying that way. Heard about the meeting in town, the one in the spring. A pause. Heard Mara Hale's name brought up 3 times in one conversation at the feed store last week. She'd be embarrassed to hear that. Probably. Eli adjusted his hat against the sun. I also heard you bought Mercer's 40 head. I did. The old man nodded slowly, the nod of someone confirming an arithmetic that came out the way he'd expected. You know, he said, that day on the road when I told you about Prescott and the goats, I didn't tell you to do anything with it. I just told you the story. I know. I've told that story a few times over the years. Different people. He was quiet for a moment. You're the first one who did anything with it. Gideon thought about that. He thought about the kitchen table in July, the map, Mara sitting across from him drumming her fingers. He thought about the heat of the work and the ridiculousness of it, and the months of walking the line in the evenings, checking what the goats had done, resetting the barriers. I had a good partner, he said. That helps, Eli said. Having the right person next to you when you decide to do something stupid. We weren't sure it was stupid. You weren't sure it wasn't. The old man's eyes had a dry light in them. That's the thing, isn't it? You weren't certain, you just did it anyway. He touched his hat brim and turned his horse and rode back down the creek road the way he'd come, unhurried, his own pace, disappearing around the bend in the road as though he'd been a punctuation mark in a sentence that had taken a year to finish. Mara was hanging washing on the line in the side yard when Gideon found her that evening and told her about Eli's visit. She listened, working the wet cloth over the line with the efficient movements of someone doing a familiar task. You weren't certain. You just did it anyway, she repeated. That's what he said. He's right. She smoothed a shirt over the line. That's the whole of it, isn't it? Gideon sat on the fence rail nearby and watched her work. The evening was warm and still, the kind of summer evening that makes you understand why people stay in a difficult place. Because the difficult place is also, sometimes, this. The light on the hills, the smell of dry grass and clean washing, the ordinary, irreplaceable fact of your own property under your own feet. I've been thinking about something, Mara said. She didn't stop working while she talked. What? Next spring, the county meeting. She reached for another shirt. We should bring in someone from outside the valley, someone who's dealt with fireland management in a formal way. Not to take over, just to add to what we know. There's more to learn. I agree. Also, She stopped. She had the shirt half over the line, and she held it there, looking at something he couldn't see. Then she said, "I want to write it down, all of it, properly. Not just the 2 pages I handed out at the meeting. The whole thing, the methodology, the mistakes we made, the variations for different terrain, something that could be useful to someone who doesn't have an Eli Dawson telling them stories on a road." He looked at her. She was still holding the shirt half on the line, looking at the middle distance. "That's a significant piece of work," he said. "I know." "When would you—" "Evenings," she said. "Sundays. It doesn't have to be done quickly." She finished hanging the shirt. "I just think, if something works and you don't record it, it gets lost. It depends on you being there to tell it, and you're not always going to be there to tell it." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "You'll help." "Of course I'll help." She picked up the empty wash basket and looked at him with the expression that he'd been reading for 6 years, the one that meant she was checking whether he meant it or whether he was agreeing to avoid discussion. He meant it. She could tell. She went inside. That fall they bought 12 more goats, not because they needed them for the fire break, which was established and maintained. They bought them because a family on the East Road was pulling out, heading to Oregon, and their animals needed somewhere to go. And Gideon and Mara had the pasture and the knowledge and a growing feeling that the goats were simply part of what they were now. 53 goats was a different enterprise than 41. It required different thinking about pasture rotation, about winter feed, about the mechanics of moving a larger group efficiently. Mara added a section to her developing document about scaling the methodology. Gideon built 2 new handling pens in the fall, which required 3 weekends and the help of Roy Whitfield, who worked one-handed with an efficiency that had stopped being remarkable because it was simply how Roy worked now. The crooked-horned goat escaped twice during the build. Both times it was found in the vegetable garden. Both times Mara put it back without the energy for exasperation, which was either acceptance or exhaustion, and at this point she wasn't sure there was a difference. The garden had a higher fence now. The goat found a gap in it. She built the fence higher still. The goat regarded the new fence with the focused attention of a problem solver encountering an interesting challenge. "Don't," Mara told it. It looked at her sideways from beneath its crooked horn. It did not do it again that season, which she chose to interpret as respect. Years pass in a place like that. Not the way years pass in a story, where they compress into a sentence and a time skip. They pass the way years actually pass, which is slowly and then all at once, full of individual days that seem unremarkable until you look back and realize they were the days you were actually living. The Hale Ranch became something. Not famous, not the subject of newspaper articles or official recognition, just known. In the way that useful, reliable things become known in a community, the way a good well is known, or a straight fence line, or a neighbor who shows up when they say they will. People referenced it the way they referenced things that worked. They sent their hired hands to learn from Gideon. They sent their wives and their husbands to talk to Mara about the document she'd spent 3 winters putting together, which ran to 40 pages by the 2nd year and 70 by the 3rd, and was copied out by hand by more people than she'd kept count of. The fire breaks became standard practice in the valley. Not on every property. Nothing becomes standard on every property, because there are always people who are certain they don't need what everyone else does until they do, but on most of them. The cleared perimeters became part of the landscape, visible from the ridge road as a pattern of bare earth and managed brush around the ranch buildings. Unremarkable in the way safety features become unremarkable when they're common enough. There were 2 more fires in the valley over the following years. Neither of them approached the scale of the August fire, in part because the land had been managed differently, in part because the breaks interrupted the corridors the fire needed to build momentum. 11 properties with established breaks lost nothing to either fire. 3 properties without them lost barns. The numbers were not dramatic. They were just true. On a September evening, several years after the summer everything changed, Gideon and Mara sat on the porch of the cabin they had not sold, watching the light go off the hills the way it did in fall, sideways and gold, the kind of light that makes even burned-over range look like something worth painting. The herd was at full capacity now, the east pasture thick with the cattle that had seemed impossible in the bad years. The goats were in the south pasture, visible from the porch as a loose-moving shape in the fading light, their sound carrying in the still air, unchanged from the first evening they'd arrived in Gideon's wagon. Argumentative, opinionated, entirely themselves. Mara had a cup of coffee. Gideon had a cup of coffee. They sat in the specific, comfortable silence of people who have been through enough together that silence requires no justification. After a while, Gideon said, "Dan Carver told me today his son wants to take over the north section of the property, start his own operation. How old is he now?" 19. Dan says he's got a good head. He does, she said. I've talked to him. He asks smart questions. Gideon looked at the hills. Dan wants us to talk to him about the break methodology, starting from scratch on a new piece of land. I'll talk to him, she said. They sat. A sound came from the south pasture. The crooked-horned goat, specifically, which she could identify by now without looking. It had a particular quality to its complaint that was different from the others, more emphatic, as though it had opinions it considered important, and was frustrated by the ongoing failure of the world to solicit them. It was 11 years old. That was old for a goat. She didn't know when it had gotten old. She didn't know when any of it had gotten to be what it was. Gideon, she said. Yeah. Do you remember the day they arrived, the wagon coming up the road? I remember. I thought you'd lost your mind, she said. I know. I thought, this is the thing that finishes us, the last foolish thing before the whole enterprise falls apart. She looked at her coffee cup. I was so certain. He was quiet for a moment. You weren't wrong to think it, he said. It could have gone that way. But it didn't. No. She looked at the hills. The light was nearly gone now, the gold fading to gray, the first stars beginning at the edges of the sky. Here is what she understood now, that she hadn't understood then, on the porch watching that wagon come up the road. Not the lesson she would have stated at the meeting, not the methodology in the document, but the thing underneath all of it that was harder to say and closer to true. You don't know what you have until it's tested. Not your land, not your preparation, not your plans. Yourself. The person next to you. The decisions you made in the heat of an ordinary summer when nothing felt important enough to justify the effort. You don't know any of it until the fire comes and the barriers hold, or they don't, and you're standing in the smoke looking at what's still standing, and what's still standing is the sum of all the ordinary days you showed up and did the work when it seemed unlikely to matter. The 41 goats had not been the point. They'd never been the point. They were just the form that the decision took, the vehicle for a choice that could have been made with any tool, in any form, as long as it was made deliberately and worked at steadily and not abandoned because other people found it amusing. The county had learned about fire breaks. That was real and useful, and she was glad of it. But what she knew, sitting on the porch in the September dark, was that what they'd actually built over these years was something harder to measure and more durable than a cleared perimeter. They'd built the capacity to stay, to hold, to be the kind of people who don't sell when the pressure comes, who don't stop when the work is slow and the ridicule is loud and the outcome is uncertain. That wasn't a lesson she'd been handed. It was one she'd made. She finished her coffee. In the south pasture, the crooked-horned goat made its sound one more time. Final, emphatic, the last word. And then was quiet. The stars were out fully now, the enormous Wyoming stars that she'd never gotten entirely used to, that still struck her sometimes as almost too much, too many, more than a sky needed to make its point. We should go in, she said. In a minute, Gideon said. She stayed another minute. Then they went inside and the porch was empty, and the stars kept going, and in the south pasture the goats settled into the dark. And the valley lay quiet around the ranch that had not been sold, that had not burned, that had held, not because of luck, not because of certainty, but because two people had decided, in an ordinary summer, that it was worth holding on to, and had gone on deciding that, one day at a time, until it became true,